Okay, hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and also good afternoon to those of you who, depending on where you live in the world, we are very pleased to have you today on our session on the role of learning and development in the future of humanitarian response. I hope you can hear us well. My name is Geneviève Sivogt. I am the training lead at CHS Alliance. And CHS Alliance is very pleased to host this panel session as an HNPW LED partner. As you might have read, this panel session is organized by the Training Provider Forum, which is a group of 9 organizations focused on humanitarian learning and training. And you can see the logo of all the members at the bottom of this presentation. I am handing over to M. Lacroix to introduce us to this webinar. M, over to you.
Thank you, Geneviève, and good morning, good afternoon, good night to our participants and our panel members. So delighted to be here. And if we move on to the next slide, and while we do that, I'd love for all of you to drop in the chat functionality, just your name and where you're joining us from, so we have an idea of where is everybody and what time it is in your corner of the world. So you've heard my colleague Geneviève, who's been making that session possible on the behalf of the CHS Alliance, hosting us today. We are joined by my other colleague, Esther Grinder, who's based in London, and she works for the HLA, the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, as a global community and partnership lead. And myself, joining you from Paris, France, where I work for the online learning platform disasterready.org as a senior partnership development manager. And we are delighted to have you here today with us, looking at no small topic when it comes to the role of learning and development in the present and the future of humanitarian response. And God knows that facing the number of crises and acceleration we are witnesses, we really need to sort of get together and but continue thinking about how the role we have, whether as training provider, as learning and development practitioner or line manager or anyone interested in this topic, our role in enabling and empowering the humanitarian of the future. And to do that, we are joined by an amazing panel made of amazing women, and I'm proud to say we are a panel of women today that will be sharing, their own perspective from where they sit, whether at a big picture level or more focusing on very specific context. So we have, and they will introduce themselves much better than me. But we have Gloria Miranda joining us from Colombia. So well done, Gloria, for joining us so late in your night. Sophie Nyokabi, who will be joining us from Kenya, Juliet Parker in the UK, and Zeynep Sanduvag, who's joining us from Turkey. So very delighted to have our panelists with us. You know the drill. We've been doing these, online webinar and conference for a while, but we have a little slide on housekeeping. If we can move to that, please. And I think, most of you are probably familiar with Zoom, but just, I think you're all on mute, but if you're not, make sure you do stay on mute. We will use the chat as we've done at the beginning to, for generic sort of intro and comment. And then if you have specific question as you hear the different presentation from our panelists, make sure to use the Q&A section of Zoom, and know that we will address that at the end. And obviously, we are all coming from a place of respect and inclusivity. So we want to make sure everybody keeps, question and comment respectful and on topic. It's always tempting to go off on a tangent sometimes, but we want to make sure we respect each other. And just a quick point also on the Q&A, depending on the volume of question we have, or, if you see a question that you really want to see being addressed, make sure you vote for it in the Q&A section when it comes to that. So as I said, moving on to the agenda, by bringing, that amazing panel, but also you all that clearly work in L&D or are interested about the challenge we face as a profession and as a a key function in our sector. We'll look at how we, facing the pace of change and the challenges being thrown at us, how we can enable the humanitarian of the future from now. And what's changing about the way we deliver humanitarian assistance. How do we make sure our approach to learning and development and capacity strengthening is keeping up and even potentially anticipating the acceleration and the flow of changes we have to face, and how can we as L&D passionate, let me put it this way, how can we support and socialize these changes and facilitate that transformation that is unfolding, in front of our eyes. So we want to make sure, we anticipate as much as possible and we focus on that workforce readiness that is such a key topic beyond our sector, but definitely from where we all sit. So our panel member will explore recent example of how their organization have engaged with this theme in their own work, sharing challenges and lesson learned and suggestion on how we can take that forward. So very much looking forward to each of our panel members to share this experience. If I could just go to the next slide and starting, turning it back to you all joining us today. If you could in the chat answer that question, and I know we know it's a big question, but that would give us an idea of, if not what keeps you up at night, what do you really see as the theme or the themes that you need to focus on from a learning and capacity strengthening sort of perspective in our sector. So feel free to drop your answer in the chat. We really love to hear. And on this big question, I'm turning over to my colleague Esther for the next few slides.
Lovely, thanks, Em. And so while we're watching those answers come in, I will just give a little bit of background to the topic for today's webinar. Do feel free, if you're typing your answers into the chat as well, to introduce yourself and say where you're dialing in from. We'd love to know who's on the call. So setting out the topic for this webinar, what do we mean by the future of humanitarian response, first of all? So on your screen there, you can see many of the factors that we all know are affecting the way that humanitarian response is changing. We all know that there's a mounting humanitarian need globally. So I think it's something like 1 in 22 people globally are in need of humanitarian assistance currently. And that's increasing all the time. I think the number went up 30% between 2022 and 2023. So there's a huge mounting humanitarian need in the sector as a result of some of the factors that are there on your screen. And that, of course, creates a much bigger need for us as learning professionals to be prepared for that and to be able to offer training and learning that really supports preparedness across the sector. In addition to that, we're seeing that just the sheer numbers of humanitarian staff are increasing as well. So of course, with more crises happening, there's also many more people working in the sector. There was a 40% increase in humanitarian staff between 2013 and 2022, and a 10% increase in the number of organisations, and those are mostly local and national organisations. And we also know that 90% of staff in crisis contexts are nationals. So this is our kind of our audience, I guess, or our kind of user base for humanitarian learning in the sector, which is increasing in size all the time. So I guess one question for us as learning people is how can we meet this increasing need? But also whilst ensuring that what we're doing is kind of targeted and impactful. We know that anyone inside or outside the humanitarian sector has many different kind of calls on their time these days. There's so many different devices that people have. There's so many different offers out there, different websites where you can get your learning and things. So how do we make it kind of really clear where people can access the learning they need when they need it? And also just to touch on the fact that I suppose the topics that are important to people are changing as well in the sector. One example, I guess, is the impact of new technologies on how we deliver humanitarian work, and that is creating a need for digital skills training at all levels. As quite a kind of traditional sector, I guess, this is not something where we naturally have expertise. So it's an area where we need to bring more expertise into the sector. And of course, all the new technologies create opportunities and challenges as well in the way that we deliver learning and training. And here, this is just an example from a recent report from NetHope on the state of digital skills in the sector. And so they looked specifically at what digital skills people need. And this is just a snapshot of their findings. But it's interesting to think that we don't necessarily put these types of skills top of the list in terms of training needs, but it's one example of how the topics that people need training on are changing. And then just to touch as well on kind of how we deliver learning in the sector. And some of the kind of, I guess, more existential kind of questions that we're facing as learning people in the sector. And the way that we operate, I guess, we're always having to kind of really kind of question ourselves in light of the localization agenda and things like that, to think about the way that we deliver learning, and to make sure that it's not some kind of, global north to global south process necessarily, to think about whose knowledge are we really valuing in the system. Does the way that we deliver learning perpetuate kind of current power dynamics and power imbalances in the sector? And how can we make sure that we're really offering learning that is relevant to the majority of humanitarian staff in the sector? So that 90% of people working in humanitarian contexts that are national staff. And how can what we're doing really support system change and support localization in the sector? How can our learning offers support those processes? So these are just some of the kind of ideas that I had when thinking about this question. And I think what's going to be really interesting is hearing our panelists talking about the specific factors that they feel are affecting how humanitarian learning is changing. And I'm going to hand over next to Juliet Parker, who's the director at ALNAP, who's going to talk about what needs to change so that the sector can learn more effectively. And ALNAP's done loads of interesting work and research and thinking in this area. So I'm really interested to hear what Juliet's going to say.
Great, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure, as always, to take part in these webinars. I'm going to talk a little bit about where ALNAP sees the needs to change so that the sector can learn more effectively. Just as a little reminder, ALNAP is the learning network for the humanitarian sector. We were set up 26 years ago to improve coordination around learning on the basis that the humanitarian sector needs to find space and create space to address the collective learning challenges. So the learning challenges that can't be addressed by individual agencies alone. And learning is a complex topic, as I realised I've worked at ALNAP for a few years. For one thing, learning is a dumping ground of all sorts of things that aren't very well defined, but also because it's intricately connected with with layers and layers, one of which is this really important area of individual learning and training. So in terms of learning and development, I think it's fair to say that the humanitarian sector has never had such a well-qualified, experienced and well-trained cohort as it does now. And of course, there's still plenty of areas for improvement, but really we've seen across the sector a huge push on creating accessible training opportunities and learning opportunities for individuals, which have really had an impact on the professionalization of the humanitarian sector. There's now a wealth of in-person and online training opportunities, documented standards and guidelines that are very accessible. Academic courses, of course, are also increasing. And many of them are free and very accessible, which is great. Really, really great. But from our analysis at LNAP, we see that there still remain two challenges for the sector in being able to really capitalise on the knowledge and experience of the individuals. The first is around accessibility. We know that there is still a massive inequality of access to training and learning opportunities across the sector. And I think some of the presentations we'll hear in a moment will give some really good examples of how initiatives are addressing that. But whilst the majority of flexible financing still goes to northern institutions, so that's inevitably where the majority of learning capacities sit. The second really big inhibitor that we found is time. So in a recent survey that we did, we found that 46% of humanitarians said that they didn't have time for learning, which is a huge cultural challenge. And that gets more pronounced the closer you go to project delivery, where the financing structure of our system means that those closest to the communities and closest to the delivery are the ones who are tightest bound to kind of contract delivery timelines and can really find it hardest to find time to be able to dedicate to learning. But we would say in LNAP that the actual blockages to learning are much more complex than that. And one of the biggest ones is around organisational culture. And that's where we find that this great investment and development of individual capacities through these wonderful training opportunities that now exist are still bumping up against organisational cultures that don't really enable teams and individuals in the organisation to capitalise and make best use of the learning that exists. And that learning can be formal learning and informal learning, of course. And there's a lot of recognition, increasing recognition of the value of the tacit knowledge and the tacit experience that individuals hold. One of the pieces of research that we're doing at LNAP at the moment with the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub is looking at trying to better understand how learning happens in new and emerging crises. And I think one really important finding that's coming out is that the humanitarian sector tends to be very reliant on kind of processes in the first 3 or 6 months of an emergency, particularly around kind of learning and delivery. But actually what we found talking to the participants in the research was that largely humanitarian implementers and operational decision makers aren't particularly engaging with the formalized, and by that I mean real-time reviews, real-time evaluations, structured monitoring processes, and rely much more heavily on their personal and professional networks. And what this means, and this is quite important because what it means is that with the system focusing so much on process learning, actually it's giving insufficient attention to individuals' kind of most intuitive form of learning, which is to reach out to people they know. And I think this is really important because what it suggests to us, and there might be some good examples today, is that the importance for creating space for people to exchange with other experienced humanitarians is really, really important. People need to receive knowledge and information, but most importantly, humanitarians, and we've looked at this in our audience research in LNAP, they need space to be able to exchange on an interpersonal level and benefit from each other's experience. And actually, the humanitarian sector isn't great at doing that, though training opportunities is one particularly valuable opportunity. The other downside and risk of this interpersonal form, and we call it kind of spontaneous, unplanned forms of learning, is that if you tend to rely on your own personal networks, your learning bubble is a bit too small. For example, I will tend to reach out to people that I've worked with, who I know and like, and who I communicate with easily, but there'll probably be more people like me because that's my comfort zone. So actually, these training opportunities and learning opportunities are really important because they're a way of increasing that bubble, creating broader groups but for exchange and creating a much more inclusive conversation. And that's really important because when we think about system theory, systems thinking, and the role that individual and collective learning plays in evolving the system, we need to increase and diversify the range of learning spaces that exist with the system in order to create a fertile environment for experienced humanitarians and new humanitarians coming into the sector to question, learn, and evolve the sector sufficiently to be fit for the future. I had one more point before I do, which is a point that we're making as many times in as many forums as we can in ALNAP. The future of the humanitarian sector these coming few years is going to be quite challenging. We've got the geopolitical shifts, we've got funding shortfall, and we've got increasing complexity of need and complexity of crises. And there's lots of reasons why things are going to become more challenging in the humanitarian sector, and the humanitarian sector itself is going to struggle to understand how best it can evolve. One thing that we would say, and we'll keep saying, is that the sector is rich, rich, rich in learning and experience, but it's not doing enough to unlock the potential of that. And that's where I think these learning and development opportunities are so important, because how can we really capitalize on the wealth of experience and knowledge and learning that already exists in the system and create more space for that in a way that enables the system to become much more responsive and adaptable and have much tighter learning cycles, particularly at the project and program level, to be able to really respond as effectively as it possibly can to the increasingly complex crises that are on the horizon. That's it from me. I hope that's useful.
Thank you so much, Juliet. That was great. And I really love those points around the importance of our networks, particularly, you know, the idea that when somebody is actually in the process of dealing with an emergency and working on a humanitarian response, at that time, they're not reaching out for kind of formal trainings and things like that. They're reaching out to people that they know. And it's the importance of having that really strong kind of bubble and network in place. And thinking about how we can build that through the kind of learning and development opportunities that we design. So thank you so much for that. I think I'm handing over to Em to introduce our next panelist. If I can change the slides, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, and thank you, Esther. And yes, delighted to be bringing Zeynep to share what, you know, the direct link with what we've heard around how we can improve practices and collaboration really in real time. So sharing your experience from the response, you know, to the earthquake that happened in Turkey and Syria recently. And I think, you know, what we've heard about the sort of capacity we're really good in the sector at responding, because that's what we do, responding fast, but you know, sometimes it can compromise how we support the learning process. So over to Zeynep to show how we can try to make these two pressure points cohabit and support us.
Thank you, Em. Thank you. And thank you to all. You are here for joining this session, and hopefully we will learn from each other. So in terms of learning as a way to improve practice and collaboration experience from Turkey, Syria earthquake response, as Nrengi Association, one of the national NGO. We are in Turkey, Istanbul based, but since the Kahramanmaraş earthquake, we are working in the region since 6th of February, the earthquake time, more than 1 year. We used CHS training as a learning way to improve practice and collaboration. So I will explain what we did and how we used the CHS training to create practice and collaboration opportunities among the responders. So next slide, please. Yeah, this is our cover page, and then yeah, please go on. So just let me explain what is the scope of the earthquake. The impact of Kahramanmaraş earthquake was devastating, and 15 million affected people across 10 provinces, and immediately reported 65,000 deaths and around 160,000 injuries. So you are seeing the map, and then you are seeing the geographical area. And next slide, please. And also there is comparative examples of the energy released from major historical disasters based on the Kahramanmaraş earthquake. So you are seeing the joules from different cases, different historical disasters. Just I would like to say, even if we compare the released energy with Hiroshima atomic bombing, its joule was 15 trillion, and Kahramanmaraş earthquakes, because it was back-to-back 3 earthquakes around 7 magnitude, 7 and 7 point magnitude, 30 quadrillion. So the energy was huge, and because of this reason, it was really, really devastating earthquake. Yeah, next slide, please. So with the collaboration CHS Alliance, NRENG Association organized CHS training as targeting audiences, humanitarian aid workers involved in earthquake response efforts in the region. Next slide, please. So the target group was mostly national and local NGOs, including public authorities, academia, and some volunteer initiatives. So in terms of this learning opportunity, we focused on mostly 4 main purposes. One of them is increase awareness and understanding of the CHS commitments relevant to the earthquake response in the region, and especially enhance the implementation of CHS commitments specifically tailored to address the unique challenges, the needs of affected people, affected population in the region. Because of this reason, we called earthquake-focused CHS training. And then also promote a common language in terms of the unified approach, promote a common language and approach among all responders in this disaster. And we focused on especially fostering effectiveness, coordination, collaboration, and communication through the humanitarian efforts. So, next slide, please. Our training modality was based on conducting introductory training and also follow-up sessions. So because of this reason, we conducted this training in 2 phases. In first phase, we delivered this session, and especially in the introductory training, earthquake response. We focused on the earthquake examples and how the commitments can apply to earthquake-related needs. And also, we discuss with the participants their implementation and how their implementation are aligned or relevant to the CHS commitment. And we gave homework to them. It was volunteer work. Also, during our training announcement, we mentioned this, we get their expression of interest, and we mentioned that the participants will be a position for sharing their experiences 3 weeks later with a small short presentations. So our idea was creating knowledge and experience sharing based on the CHS implementation in the region. And then during the follow-up session, we provided a platform for hearing from them, mostly hearing from them in terms of their implementation of the CHS in the field. And then there was a productive discussion how the implementation can be transfer from one province to other, because there was 10 provinces and each province's dynamics were different. Next slide, please. So just I would like to get your attention, especially examples of implementation of CHS commitments on the ground, phase 1 training program, because of course, before this, CHS, who uses CHS and CHS commitments and structure of CHS, we provided this information. But in terms of this examples part, next slide, please, and then I request to return here. In terms of example parts, we provided some tools, guidelines, and policy papers for each commitment in terms of creating awareness and applicability, showing them the applicability of these tools in the field. In terms of each commitments. So we click the links. Mostly we try to focus on Turkish versions. Just for your understanding, I kept these English version, but mostly we provided Turkish versions, tools, and then we clicked each tool, explain them, how they can be used in the field. So previous slide, please. Thank you, great. And in terms of the follow-up session, as I mentioned, it was a really productive part, because based on their experiences and using these tools or some challenges for using these tools in the field, they shared their experiences in their presentation. And next slide, please, again. Yeah, they give some examples. For instance, this tool was useful. We used really in smooth way, but this tool is really difficult for us. We need some additional support. So as to the reflections from participants during their follow-up session based on their presentation. For instance, one participant mentioned their experiences related commitment 1 and commitment 4. Somehow they use these two commitments as complementary. So she mentioned that how they utilize need assessment tools, especially severe WASH checklist and need assessment part in the field, and then how they reflect the information in the tools while their kit distribution or hygiene material distribution. And as a complementary, she added that they set up some hygiene committees in the tent areas, and then they provide environment, they provide space for the participants. How can they reflect their idea for improving the WASH related activities? And then as a result, there was a progress for the tent population. Accessibility to the shower and the toilet facilities, including the accessing the basic hygiene materials. And second example related to complaints and feedback mechanism. So he mentioned that the timing was really great, because as an organization, national small organization, they were thinking about how they can set up a complaint mechanism. So in terms of our example tool sharing session, he mentioned that they reach these complaint mechanism tools, and they try to adapt this mechanism, tailor their mechanism to their response in the field. So this type of these are just examples. There were 34 participants, and they shared their experiences, their reflections, how they used CHS in the field just 3 weeks later. And then so far, I think, yeah, we conducted this training in April. And then they mentioned if there is a chance for continuing sharing and experience sharing and experience opportunity. And then we set up a WhatsApp account. Now it is really productive and a busy platform. There are some points they are sharing each other, and then they are asking, getting an answer under Nirengi's supervision. Yeah, next slide, please. So I would like to focus on some takeaways based on this learning opportunity, especially the organizational responsibilities of CHS. It was really interesting for the participants. They mentioned that first time they come across with a learning material, the organizational responsibilities clearly are being mentioned there, especially the executive participants and staff. They gave their positive feedback. How they can use these organizational responsibilities in terms of CHS. And localization is really important. And then during whole process, localization mentioned by the participants. So it was really good in terms of the follow-up session. They shared their localized examples. And the most important part mentioned that the post-training follow-up, as we did with the support of CHS Alliance, and support mechanism, because delivering the training is really okay, important starting point, but if there isn't any follow-up part and support mechanism, the humanitarian aid workers and the staff are just in a position, how can they use this information? Maybe in somehow they are just lifting this information behind, and they are forgetting, and so on. So the follow-up session is important. And also promotion of the CHS by donors. I would like to mention this part, especially the program part and proposal. During the proposal discussion process, donors' expectation for including the CHS, CFIR, and the other humanitarian standard partnership quality and accountability framework in the project cycle would be really useful for dissemination of the CHS and the other standards, I think. It is okay from my side. That's all. So I don't know if there is a question and so on. I think we will get later. Thank you so much.
Oh, and thank you, Zeynep, and very well done, because your presentation really, build on what we've heard from Juliette about how you've addressed the lack of time for training and the need to create that space for learning between peers, the people we work with, but expanding the bubble as well. I think, it's soliciting this input and creating space for this interactive conversation is so vital, as we've heard, and you've demonstrated it. sharing that real life learning, learning, and the contextualization, because if we want to have actionable and concrete sort of tools, it has to be rooted in where the response is taking place, and making it your follow-up sort of approach and the support mechanism you put in place. And I love your use of WhatsApp. It's making sure again that it's not a one-off intervention, because if we really want to empower the community and build these skills, this professionalization we've heard about, and also the resilience, it has to happen in that sort of really, that approach really anchored in the local context with the languages and the people that are most, involved into that. So again, thank you so much, because you made a perfect sort of illustration of a point we've raised at the start. And from there, if we can move the slide to the next one, the next one, and then I hand over to Esther, who's going to introduce our next panelist. And thank you again, Zeynep.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Zeynep. And I'm seeing lots of good questions coming in, so keep them coming in. As we mentioned, we're going to get to them all at the end, so just feel free to type them in, and we'll be noting them as we go along. And now I'm going to hand over to Gloria Miranda from IECA, who's a research and training expert based in Colombia, and it's 3 a.m. where she is, so thank you so much again for joining at this very inconvenient time for you. But this is going to be really interesting, because Gloria is going to give us a perspective from when she was a humanitarian trainee and how that changed as she became a trainer. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Gloria is going to say about that. Can I hand over to you, Gloria? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Hello, thank you very much for being here. Okay, I will share my personal experiences as both as trainee and a trainer in local context, and how this led me to become part of the Institute of Studies on Conflict and Humanitarian Action. I believe my journey exemplifies the significant role that learning and development play in the future of humanitarian response, particularly in line with the commitment to localization, as Zeynep mentioned it before. Next slide, Esther, please. So I started my professional journey at the turn of the century from a local perspective, operating from empirical experience in one of the areas most affected by the armed conflict here in Colombia. In this context, at least where we were, the terminology around humanitarianism had not yet entered the conversation. No guidelines, not standards, anything. And the only international intervention were those of the ICRC. So we used to respond to IDPs who were actually our neighbors based on national legislation. Drawing from this experience, we developed a learning strategy for municipal authorities and disaster risk management organizations, focuses on this new topic to generate a coordinated response. Next, please. That is how some years late, my participation as a trainee in a sphere TOT is a significant milestone, as I discovered that a global community was facing similar challenges, working towards a consensus of minimum standard for humanitarian aid. For me, it was a surprise. However, we deal with similar situations. By then, I was an apprentice, a trainee, who received that information brought by the experts. This experience not only shaped my perspective, but also served as a precursor to many more learning opportunities with similar initiatives over the years. Consequently, I took on the role of a trainer while continuing work for different organizations over the following years. So I link this experience with Joliet's reflection on how individual learning opportunities can lead to organizational change. So I like to believe that I have contributed to strengthen local organization, not only by being part of them, but through various learning strategies. I had adapted international learning information as standards, guidelines to fit the language, customs, capabilities, and experience of local organizations. Next, please. No, I am part of the IECA, which participates in large debates related to the humanitarian world. And while recognizes that merely involving the national staff of the countries it works with, like me, doesn't necessarily fit with the localization commitment, I believe that as a local staff who is closely and familiar with the local context, play a significant role in interacting with those organizations, helping them become more empowered in the relationship with international organizations. Which brings us to the question that Esther mentioned. So does our approach to learning reflect wider power imbalances in the sector? The IEC's commitment to gender equality leads us to believe that effective localizations must be feminist. I mean, we are actively working to avoid reproducing patriarchal systems and incorporating insights from feminism to transform power imbalances among organizations. The challenge is to create a learning environment that promotes the leadership of local organizations, preventing them from having to irreversibly conform to the dynamics of the international community. In this context, I would like to highlight the paradox that arises as the Grand Bargain turns 8 years just this month. But for individuals, for local Spanish-speaking organizations, as well as another not English speakers from what I understand, it is not easy to link the term localization with its meaning in English. Gilbert mentioned it in the question panel. So this presents a paradox where the application of universal concepts in dominant language within diverse local contexts often reinforce the unequal status between those who speak the language and those who don't, thus contradicting the sense of localization. In response, we, IECA, we are committed to addressing language barriers, at least for speaking countries. IECH publication and most training materials are delivered in Spanish. And we also translate key documents from other languages into Spanish to enhance accessibility. Next. So to conclude, yes, we can help overcome wider power imbalances in the sector, and yes, by using an approach to learning based on the needs, capabilities, and inspiration of local organizations. We can improve the future humanitarian response with quality, using learning as a tool to empower local organizations by training local staff. An example is the possibility to participate in this kind of international discussion based on our visions and proposals as local agents, for which I thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Gloria. And you've highlighted a real irony there in terms of the fact that localization is a term that really doesn't translate very well into Spanish. And I've heard that as well from, I think I've heard that in relation to Arabic and other languages as well. Yeah, so that shows how some of the power imbalances are definitely perpetuated through the kind of language that we use. And it was really interesting to hear how your organization and yourself are being sort of very intentional about how you use learning to try to support local organizations to be able to have a voice in the kind of wider international humanitarian network as well. Thank you. So I'm handing back to Em to introduce our next panelist.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Esther. And we continue with our exploration of what it looks like to think about training and learning at a very sort of contextualized level, and who need to learn and when. So I'm delighted to bring our colleague Sophie, who's joining us from Kenya, and she will build on what we've heard from Gloria, but that need to meet learner where they are. So over to you, Sophie. Sophie, yes, sorry.
Thank you very much. Please confirm that you can hear me.
We can, thank you.
Oh, awesome, awesome. Thank you. And appreciation to my predecessors. I've really enjoyed listening to what your perspectives, and it really does resonate with what I'm going to share. By way of introduction, I've been working in the humanitarian sector within the continent of Africa for the last 25 years or so. And my discussion this today, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, will be from a bird's eye point of view, based on my experience working with different organizations, different humanitarian situations, and in different countries and contexts. So I'll bring that all together and maybe just kind of summarize what are my findings, what am I seeing. And in the next slide, I have just put together a couple of statistics that we have within the region that are looking at. In the next slide, please. Yes, looking at overall within the sub-Saharan Africa, we are looking at over 92 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. That's a significant number. And this was just by the end of March. We are facing currently in the region El Nino crisis, which of course will push this number significantly higher. Of those 92 million, we have over 51 million who are facing food insecurity. And we also have 22 million who have been displaced from their homes, primarily owing to issues that have related to climate-induced disasters, as well as conflict and insecurity within the region. And just to sum up, one of the key issues that we have been grappling with in the region is the flooding, which has affected over 9.2 million. And like I said, these statistics are collated from and until the end of March this year. So if we were to look at what is currently happening in my own country, we have got major significant floods happening. This will push the figures much, much higher. In the next slide, we look at dimensions of learning and development. And one of the key things I would like to talk about this today is basically strengthening the capacity of humanitarian workers, so that the people who are the first responders, the people who come in, whether as agencies, as national government, as local organizations, are all looking at this or are grappling with this. The first dimension I would want to look at is skill enhancement, whereby we are saying that L&D is premised on enhancing the skills of the humanitarian actors, and specifically local communities. I've heard the previous speakers talk about localization from their different perspectives, and even here it is the same thing, so that we are looking at building the capacity of local organizations to be able to respond effectively and efficiently. The second dimension is adaptation to the context. Within the sub-Saharan Africa, we are 54 countries, all very different. In any one given country, we also have different contexts. So therefore, it pushes it a lot. It makes it a lot more complicated to adapt learning and development to these very unique and diverse people. And again, a very critical thing is our population. demographics, we have over 60% of our population being under 25 years of age. So the learning and development needs to focus on a young population, geographically dispersed and with so many cultural and as well as other dimensions to them. And then we have the promotion of sustainable initiatives. And here we are looking at increasingly addressing the fact that humanitarian needs or interventions tend to be urgent because of the situation, tend to be short-term, but then that does not lend the community or the change agents to be able to build resilience in the community for them to be able to withstand subsequent shocks that will or the subsequent shocks that would put them in a similar situation. And that brings me to the last dimension, whereby we are saying that L&D should build or rather aims at building resilience at both the individual, the person who has been affected, the community in which they are in, as well as enabling people to better cope and recover from disasters, because we do know that just looking at the last 5 years or so, we have noted that the number of disasters are increasing in terms of frequency, in terms of the scope, and in terms of the impact of this disaster, meaning that more and more people are being predisposed to humanitarian situations. These very young people, these people dispersed in different areas and in different contexts, but nonetheless, they are grappling with increasing humanitarian issues. And in the next slide, we are looking at the challenges that come there, that are prevalent or that hamper the effectiveness of delivering or attaining effective L&D. And one of these is resource constraints. I'm sure you will agree with me that resources are decreasing, especially for humanitarian areas, especially where there is protracted crisis. And resources tend to be allocated to the emergent issues. And those countries that have been in protracted crisis tend to come into the back burner, so to speak. And therefore, in any organization, I hope you will agree with me that also learning and development is allocated the least amount of money, and it's usually the first to get bumped out in case there is another emerging issue that needs to be addressed in that particular organization or even in that country's perspective. Therefore, the resources available for learning and development at national and subnational as well as community levels are really diminishing, and they're also stretched, and learning is not the first priority. It's always given a back burner position. Then we have the infrastructure challenges, such as poor transportation networks, unreliable electricity, and limited internet connectivity. And this can seriously impede the delivery of learning, especially in remote or conflict-affected areas. When we are unable to access remote communities, then even the issue of how we can be able to effectively deliver learning in those areas is a challenge. In the third place, we are looking at security, where, like I mentioned a little bit earlier on, in many parts of our continent, humanitarian workers are facing security risks because, again, of the conflict that is there. There is violence, there is instability in this. And therefore, in a place where it is insecure, in a place where access is limited, learning cannot take place. Right now in my country, we are looking at a delayed reopening of schools because of the flooding that is there. And this is something, I'm just giving you this as an example, such that where there is other existing conditions or imagined crisis, then learning takes and even is relegated even further down the list of priorities. And lastly, there is the aspect of resistance to change. When we are learning, we are challenging the way we have always understood and done things. My predecessors have talked about even the gap that is there in terms of the word localization in the local language. So to be able to address that, we need to change our mindset. And more often than not, as adults, we are more resistant to change as opposed to young people. And therefore, for L&D to be effective, we need to address how to change the mindset of individuals, communities, as well as peoples in any given context. In the subsequent slide, we are looking at what can be done towards a resilient humanitarian actors. I want to highlight 3 things that are very, very critical. The first one is increased resource allocation, where we are looking at prioritization of funding, especially for local organizations. You will agree with me that more often than not, local organizations are not able to access international funding, primarily because of the reason that they are lacking the capacity or even the governance structures. They are not able to absorb or to even meet the stringent requirements that are laid down by the international community. So we need to build their capacity so that we can prioritize funding to the local communities. And very important is access to contextualized materials. I've been a trainer now for over 20 years. And in each place where I'm going to train, I have to continuously, I have to continuously remove or address the context that is there. If a material has been developed for one country, I need to contextualize it to country B. And sometimes because of budget constraints, this contextualization is not done effectively. And therefore, we tend to bring materials or learning modes and approaches that are not relevant or most applicable to the community or to the context in which we want to facilitate the learning and development. In the second place, I'm looking at innovation and technology, where things like e-platforms have come, have emerged and have taken a much larger space in terms of the mode of training delivery. We also have the knowledge hubs for transference of skills, whereby we can amalgamate. Somebody has just shared the ECHO platform, and those are great. Those are platforms that we should increasingly socialize people to be able to access, as well as open them up for more and more use. And lastly is community engagement and participation, and where I would like to really emphasize that in designing any learning, in the implementation and evaluation of L&D programs, the local community has to be involved, not only as recipients, but also as being part and parcel of designing how this is going to be done. I was in a community about 2 months ago, and we were talking about indigenous knowledge in terms of early warning and early action in the face of impending disasters. And we were saying that there is need to bring on board persons who can be able to bring the local indigenous knowledge. How did the olden, in the previous generations, how did they look at it's going to, their forecast presents that it's going to rain, and this is not just the ordinary rain, or we are looking at a period of extended drought, and therefore what do we need to do? Because there is increasing evidence evidence that leads to a dichotomy between the evidence that is being generated in terms of alerts and in terms of translating this into early action for the affected community, and therefore what is the resultant humanitarian crisis that is there. So I pose it to you this today that these are the three things that, in my experience over the last so many years, can lend to a deeper engagement and a more effective L&D in the sub-Saharan African context. Thank you, and over.
Sorry, let me put myself out of mute. Thank you so much, Sophie. I've lost your camera. I mean, we still heard you, so I hope, yeah, oh, you're back. So maybe that was just my connection. Thank you so much. And again, such a great sort of connection with what we've heard about the need to really, meet learners where they are, and taking into consideration demographics, like you said, with that young sort of, that big part of the population being of younger than me for sure, and younger age, and how we, there are all these global tools, but how, it really needs to be localized wherever it makes sense, and owned by people that will use it, and so we can build that resilience as learning and development intervention and expert, but much beyond, as a sector sort of working and addressing various crises, whether they're hot or, protected, as you said. What really stand out as well from what I heard is, we've heard about access issue at so many levels, whether it's security issue, connectivity, the infrastructure, the language, and resources, not to mention the obvious. So it's really that need to keep in mind that we, what we, in some part of the world, what we might take as something easy to use or roll out or understand, we need some humility from some of us to really remember that doesn't apply across the board, and unlock these capacities, but really see it from the perspective, like I said, the learner where they are, the community where they are. So I think it's a bit like that, an idea of reverse mentoring, but where we were talking about spaces at the beginning, really creating, in all honesty and humility, these spaces to hear from each other, including, community members who've been, they're always the first responder because they're there, and they've been facing, for many community, a lot, far too many crises we can't even remember. So it's been great to hear your testimony, Sophie, and thanks again for bringing that voice from your very dense expertise and experience for all this year. So we have heard from all our panelists, which is great, and I really want to thank all of you. We've been I know there have been some questions answered in the Q&A, but maybe sorry, I'm reading in the same time that I'm speaking, which demonstrates we can't multitask. It's a myth. So let me just come up. I have one. Sorry. So for the rest of my colleagues, making that session possible, I'm just going to read the questions still live in the Q&A, and then Esther, if you want to take the next one. But we have one live question that has been voted by a few of us to be addressed. And on the mention of, and sorry, I can't quote who's asked the question because it's anonymous attendee, which I completely understand. So thank you, whoever you are. And it's about online resources and what do we see as the main place where humanitarians go for learning and development, and where, so, I've seen some responses around that, and Esther and I can obviously go and mention the platforms such as Kaya and Disaster Ready. I know the Federation of the Red Cross has a similar offer. So the great thing about our sector is that generosity in sharing and leveraging that technology to make open, platform to access that learning. Then the question goes on to see the role of chatbot that can raise awareness of the use of new emerging technology to make decisions, as well as directing users to these learning and development resources. So I don't know if any of our panelists want to, as the experience, I've used chatbot and other sort of artificial intelligence generated sort of tools to continue spreading, raising awareness and putting resources out there. I don't know if any of you want to jump in.
I can say something, but I can't really talk about AI.
No, go ahead, Juliet. Go
No
ahead.
matter how much I try to understand it, I still struggle.
Don't
I think
worry.
I probably won't answer the question, but I think there are some interesting observations that we've made recently. We did some audience analysis on humanitarians and how humanitarians communicate learning, because we found there was a really significant evidence gap. Most of our communication research in the sector is about how we communicate with funders and how we communicate with disaster affected communities. But there's very little evidence about how humanitarians can effectively communicate their humanitarian learning to other humanitarians. And we make a lot of assumptions as a sector that without, even when we also know it's not a good thing. So everybody here will have forwarded on a PDF that they haven't read, that they know the person that they're sending it to also won't read. And that's a very common practice in our sector. In terms of where places where humanitarians go for learning and development, obviously all the institutions here, represented here are excellent resources. But what we found was that on the whole, humanitarians, and particularly the more senior they get, are very unlikely to spend time browsing to see what they can find. And so what that kind of triggered for us was why it's so important to engage with new humanitarians who are coming into the sector, because as they come in, they'll kind of get familiar with a few of their favorite resources and a few of their favorite kind of sites. And those will tend to be the kind of reference sites for them throughout a good portion of their career. As people become more senior within the humanitarian sector, they tend to engage less with online learning and learning resources, and tend to rely more on what we're calling filters. So the people around them who've accessed that training or accessed that information or those sorts of things, who can then tell them about it. So it depends a little bit who you're trying to reach. I don't really have anything to say on the AI bit, but what I think is interesting, I put a comment in one of the in response to one of the questions, is that the reason why a lot of humanitarians rely on their personal and professional networks for their learning is because they are trusted sources, and it's a very time efficient way for them to get the information they need. So it's like, actually, I could do that training, but actually I could just phone so-and-so and they'll be able to tell me the bits that I need to know. So I think the interesting thing for AI is the extent to which it has the potential to replicate those qualities in an on-demand information access way.
Thank you, Juliet, and I like your the curation of knowledge we do for each other, and I think I've always done that along my career, so it's a very fair point. Okay, we might come back to chatbot, but let's continue with some question. I have one for you, Zeynep, and if you, I mean, could you tell us what factors help ensure the collaborative nature of the training course you described for us? And I know insight is a wonderful skill. So if you could do things differently, what would you change if you were to replicate such format and sort of stage approach? That would be great to hear from you.
So,
you're on mute.
yeah, there was an
Yeah.
interruption. Could you repeat your question, please?
What I will do is I will drop it in. Let me just drop it to you and Esther in the meantime, if you want to pick another question, so we don't.
Yeah, sure. So I'm quite
Thank you.
interested in this question from Mark about funding, because that's something that Sophie talked about a lot in her presentation as well. Yeah, and he's put on your point about rich learning opportunities. Do you think unlocking these requires specific funding streams from donors, or is it more about better collaboration between humanitarian agencies? And so Juliet has answered that in the chat there. But I was wondering if anyone else wanted to talk about how we unlock funding and resources for better learning opportunities in the sector, which we clearly need in order to make us be able to be just better prepared and focus more on preparedness than on response as a sector as a whole. Does anybody want to come in on that? Zeynep, are you coming in?
Zeynep, yeah.
Yep, great, lovely.
Yeah, thank you. So the housekeeping, just approach here for vacuum cleaning. I was dealing with this because of this reason I didn't catch the question. Okay, so thank you for this question. Actually, from the national NGO perspective, I would like to say a few things, especially, of course, the training, providing training is really important, and the agencies has capacity for delivering training. And in terms of any emergency, organizations are more ready, working together, learning from each other. On the other hand, accessing the funds for organizing training, especially including the follow-up session or supervision in the field, is really limited. And Juliet mentioned that especially delivery is more prioritized rather than learning during the emergency, right after the emergency. So because of this reason, donors' role is really important, as I mentioned, including the standards, like in our case, CHS, in terms of the monitoring and evaluation, including the proposal is really important. On the other hand, I think, again, donors' role is important for being open, for being accessible, for the local capacity, local organizations, NGOs, for providing immediate, timely fund for organizing CHS training and so on. And also some mutual agreement before the emergency, especially in the prone areas. I think also these points are important. Yeah, I can say this. Over. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Zeynep. And Sophie, I wondered if you wanted to come in on this point, because you talked a bit about funding and as being a major constraint that you were facing. And I was wondering if you have anything that you want to contribute on how we can better make the case for learning to donors, or how we can collaborate to make the case.
Thanks, Esther. I would say advocacy to the donors, but as well as making it central towards in the resource mobilization activities that we engage in. When we place it as a peripheral activity, then it often gets knocked out in the approval process. But if we make it central, like, for example, I'm responsible for reviewing proposals from 13 countries. And when I'm looking at these proposals before they get to the donor, then one of the key things I'm looking for, or I should enhance what they are putting into the proposals from the different countries, is how have they integrated learning in their activities of response and preparedness. I think somebody has just mentioned that we should focus a lot more on preparedness as opposed to response, where $1 spent on preparedness saves $7 in response. So if we were to use that kind of an argument and place it more effectively, so that we are saying that we are preparing communities to be better prepared, and this is an investment that will save X dollars in the final analysis, that can maybe fly with the donor. So it's an advocacy approach. And then the second, I'm using this as a multi-pronged approach, where the second prong looks also at the community, whereby they're asking, why are you busy training us when we need to be responding? So we need to engage with communities before the disasters have struck, and we are preparing them in the eventuality of a disaster striking. Because truth be told, when your house is buried in floods or in a mudslide, you cannot attend a training as good as it can be. At that time, you want effect. And more often than not, that's where humanitarian interventions are seen. But humanitarian interventions should be seen in the 4 dimensions of disaster risk management, where there is preparedness and mitigation, then there is response, and finally there is recovery and rebuilding. So if we were to focus on that, then I believe at the advocacy level with the donors and at community level, where we are preparing them effectively for how to respond before disaster strike, then learning will be a lot more receptive. Even the issue of the mindset that I talked about may be more receptive, because then that person's mindset is not in a disaster context or in a disaster setting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I think that makes a really strong case, actually, for why, from a donor's perspective, from a financial perspective, we should be looking at preparedness and therefore learning and training, rather than all of the resources being allocated to response. I thought that was a really interesting way of talking about it as well, in terms of kind of return on investment. Em, do you want to pick another question?
Yeah, thank you, Esther. And maybe a question to both Gloria and then Zeynep. If we think about, in the room here, we might have some international organization that, or, regional organization that offer training. But I'd like, from your experience, both of you, Gloria and then Zeynep, what advice would you give to these international or, regional actors providing training, how to better communicate and coordinate the training offer? Because we know, we've heard about languages not be, we can't translate localization, in a straightforward way, or, how do you make it so it's received in a way that the people that it's aimed at can see the value in it, or can contribute to it? Gloria, do you want maybe to start?
Yes, thank you, Em.
You're welcome.
Just doing that, asking us. This is the key, because we as a local staff, we have some knowledge, we have some experience, and this is my learning, when I was talking about this first times, every time people who come from another side of the world tell us, I know you don't know anything about IDPs, but oh my God, I was, in a very, very high, a lot of people coming from small towns, and we start to do our best. Of course, we make a lot of harm, but we learn about that. So ask us. And for example, talking about CHAs, we, as from the region, we participate in all of this exercise, the questionnaires, the focal groups, and everything you do to include us. So this is the way, because I think now these new standards has more Latin American focus, some kind of this, Before, the first one was too, sorry, my colleagues, but it was too African for us. So now it's we can identify more a little more with that. So yes,
That's great.
us.
I mean, that's such a, it sounds like stating the obvious, but just asking people and not assuming. I think we still have a way to go, but we're getting better at that. And I agree with you, the reversion of the CHS is definitely getting a much more inclusive and we can digest it a bit better from where we are. But so thank you, Gloria. And Zeynep, did you want to build on that? Oh, Gloria, sorry, you wanted to add something? I see you.
Don't be afraid about us. Don't be afraid about our answers, because maybe you think,
But that's about being, that when you ask a question, you need to be ready to receive the answer and act on that. So I think it's also being comfortable with the uncomfortable, of some answers. But we owe that to each other. So yeah, very good point, Gloria. Zeynep, sorry.
Yeah, just one point I could add. Generally, international organizations are chairing or hosting the national networks. So it is really a good platform for using this platform as a learning and sharing experiences. Generally, again, mostly the international agencies with UN agencies with local authorities and with public agencies. They are focusing on mostly service delivery, response. So taking some time and then using this platform for learning and sharing opportunities, and the national organizations niche response or unique experiences could be raised, could be bring this stage for showing others. So this is one point. The other point, again, in international agencies and UN agencies have some direct contact with the public agencies, with the ministries, with the implementer ministries. So again, it could be really good advocacy and capacity building for the public agencies, rather than providing fund and then giving the fund to the public agencies, just expecting some quality and accountable service. So I can add these 2 points over. Thank you.
Thank you, Danette. And maybe Sophie, I mean, I know we have a few more questions and a few more minutes, but anything you want to add on what we've just heard from your, your experience base across Africa?
Sorry, come again, Em?
No, I was wondering if you wanted to add anything to that question, but you don't have to. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot without warning you, but on what we've just heard.
No, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Turning to my colleague for other question, I have missed. Esther, do you have something?
Yeah, so I guess we've probably got time for one more question, I would have thought. So I was just looking in here and I saw that Uganda had said that they agreed very much that the sector should be investing more systematically in national regional learning hubs. And there had also been a question from Amy about, from a practical implementation perspective, what would it look like to diversify and increase the range of learning spaces, which Juliet has answered. Yeah, so I guess, does anyone have an opinion on that? What should new learning spaces look like? What new spaces should we be able to create? Does anyone want to come in on that one? Do you think we have the right learning spaces currently?
Yeah, let me just mention a little bit on that, because some of the learning that we have seen is on a platform that is not easily accessible to community members, with the whole idea of localization. But if we were to take extracts of this and have it available through mobile technology, that means working with the local companies that are offering telephone services in the country, then we can be able to disseminate a lot more of information in short bursts to the entire population, because almost everybody, well, not depending on the region and on the context, everybody would, most people would have access to a phone, even if it's not a smartphone. That information can come through on an SSD platform, and therefore it would trigger a discussion at community level, or we have all received, or a significant number of us have received this update. Can we come together and discuss what it's all about? And now that will be learning at a very localized level that is driven by the people themselves. And it is fairly inexpensive, because they're kind of effort, the kind of resource capital that is used to broadcast a message like that is very, very low. So it would just be working with different change agents to incorporate that in their methodologies or in their approaches to learning and development, not just information in a certain repository somewhere that local communities will not have access to. But given like in our context where we are talking about over 60% of our population being below 25 years. These are the people who have got gadgets and they can be able to access information and relay it in a fairly seamless manner.
That's so true. That's so true. I'm just mindful of the time. So if we can just move to the last slide. So all of you will have the contact details for our speaker and our host. And I really, really, really want to thank, on the behalf of the Training Provider Forum, our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for the four of you to take the time, wake up in the middle of the night, or continue your day quite late to be here with us. I hope that for all the participants, you find the conversation useful. I know we probably haven't addressed all the questions, so sorry about that, but do get in touch with us and be reassured that you'll be able to get the recording of that event, so of that workshop. There is so much food for thought that it's probably worth getting back into it. So I want to thank Esther, my co-host, and Anna and Geneviève and all the people that made that moment feasible. And I look forward to seeing you. We look forward to seeing you at other workshop or in person during that 2 weeks event that's being put together that we could join today. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and see you soon.
And thank you, Em, for joining. To thank
Thanks, everyone.
on
Thank
behalf
you.
of the
Bye-bye.
TDF and HS
Thank you.
Alliance.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.